Okay, in Unit 5, we're going to move on to land and water use. This is a pretty big unit. It has about 17 sections total, but it takes us about a month, so don't worry about having to squeeze it all in just a couple of weeks. First, we're going to talk about Tragedy of the Commons, which we already touched on today with the M&M Lab. Just to kind of go over one more time. The Tragedy of the Commons basically says that as individuals, we all have these shared resources. But the problem is, because we act with our own self-interest, as opposed to the common good, we take really more than our share because we don't feel as though, well, if I just take one more piece, it's not that bad. We don't realize that actually, yeah, it is kind of that bad because we all have those same feelings, and so we all collectively do more damage than if we regulate those resources. This is an example of overgrazing. So let's say all these different farmers have access to this shared land, and they're all like, you know, my sheep in this instance, they don't do that much damage. But because we have a lot of users of this resource, it gets depleted. And it has to be regulated in some way so people do like, okay, well, I'll have this piece and you have that piece. And we'll each manage our own little piece of it, and therefore it doesn't become degraded. Because we are more likely to care about a resource if we have, like if we own it in some way. Some examples, we have overfishing. So with open waters, encourages massive fishing operations, which we'll talk more about in a whole section. Passenger pigeons used to be very common in North America, but then when Europeans came to North America, they overhunted them and also cleared their forest habitat. So they're extinct now. The ocean garbage diets is another great example because, again, it's open waters, but then we all have that same idea, like my trash isn't that bad. But in places where you don't have a lot of regulations about how much trash gets into the water, we get these giant gyres or currents of just trash, and it's disgusting. But it's a collective result. Air pollution, because each person produces a little bit of pollution. Gulf of Mexico dead zone results from the use of fertilizers along the watershed for the Mississippi River. It flows down into the Gulf of Mexico, and such great concentrations causes an algae bloom, but then later on depletes nutrients, because as those algae become, or as they die and they are decomposed, the aerobic bacteria take the oxygen out of the water, creating these dead zones. Traffic congestion, you know, same thing. Everyone wants to get to their destination as easily and quickly as possible, but then we all are like, we want to take the same road, so it becomes congested. Aquifer depletion is another great example, which we'll talk more extensively about when we get to irrigation. But the Ogallala is a fantastic example because the Ogallala is underneath the Midwest where you have a lot of farming. And groundwater takes a very long time to recharge. So since we all use this resource and overuse it at that, we're seeing a massive depletion of this resource that we're all going to be affected by. Logging, if forests are managed and governed, they become depleted, especially if it's in a forest that is like between two countries or two regions that regulate it differently. With antibiotics, our overuse of antibiotics has led to strains of bacteria that are resistant to our antibiotics, and that affects us all. Light pollution, all of our individual lights can turn into something like this. It's really hard to see the night sky, it confuses nocturnal animals, all that stuff. And that's when anti-vaccination, as this movement against vaccination increases, we're hurting what's called herd immunity. So some people just naturally, like, if they have an allergy, they can't get vaccines. So they rely on what's called a herd immunity, which means like everyone else has been vaccinated around them. So if there's a disease, it's very unlikely for them to get it, because by the time it may reach them, it's already had to go through people that already have the vaccines against it, so they have that resistance to it. But if we don't have vaccinations, we see much more of an increase of spreading. And that's why we're seeing this huge increase of measles, even though that's been something that, had been eradicated, really, back in 2000, early 2000s, somewhere in there. But now we're seeing a huge resurgence, and that's because people don't get vaccinated, and so it's much easier for them to spread. All right, now as a summary, explain the concept of the tragedy of commons. Hopefully that was enough examples. But of course, if there are any questions, just let me know.